To the 13th chapter, chapter 12, Matthew chapter 12, the 12th chapter of the book of Matthew. We will start our lesson from there this morning. It's good to see all of you here. We do have, as Jeff mentioned earlier, we do have a good number of visitors today, and we do consider you our honored guests, and we appreciate you for being here. We hope you'll come back at another opportunity if you're so fortunate to have that. We started a series of lessons that will go on for some time because I'll obviously work some other things in as we go, but we started a very important lesson this past Lord's Day entitled God Give Us Christian Homes. If you were not here last week, what we looked at was just a basic evaluation of the home, and this I know seems very elementary or very simple, but basically that was our lesson last week. We talked about that the home, not the house, but the home. There's a big difference in a house and a home. But we talked about how the home is basically the foundation of what it takes to be pleasing Christians, of what it takes to be a strong church, to have a good family, to be a good influence and a shining light every day in our lives. It all starts really at home. We spend a whole lot more time at home, in our houses with our families than we do while we're here at church or really anywhere else. I know it seems like sometimes we only sleep there because we're so busy, but ultimately, as far as with our family time, there is a lot of time that is spent there, and the question is, what's going on? We looked at last week the importance of, if we're going to have a Christian home, that number one, if there is sin that is buried there, things that we just kind of brushed over, those things are going to have to be fixed. We're going to have to uncover those things. We're going to have to seek forgiveness for those things and eliminate those things, which kind of brings us to the question as we looked at, are we really focusing on God? We must focus on God, and we'll touch on that a little bit more today, but God has to be the focus, and that has to be the foundation, even before we start considering really what's inside of our homes. But once we take care of the foundational perspectives of it, and you start looking at the inside, at the interior, and what's going on there, you have to ask yourself, is there anything defiled that's kind of more in the open, anything that will cause us to be defiled that doesn't need to be there? Are we all on the same page? Striving to please God, and ultimately are we unified in doing that, striving to pray to God and talk to God every day? Assuming we do those things, and that's a lot, and I know that doesn't happen from last Sunday to this Sunday, it takes time. It's a work that we must continue at daily, but at least going on in our study to the next part, and really part 2 of the same lesson, looking at the importance of the home and what makes up a good godly home. The next 2 things that we must think of, and this will be today's lesson, and that is, number 2, keeping the newly changed home pure. Once we kind of get it into shape and get it where we want it to be, you want to keep it that way, because if you don't, it'll just revert right back to where it was at, perhaps even worse, which is what we're going to look at in just a moment. And then in closing this morning, we'll look at the idea of influencing others through our home. You know, having a Christian home is not just making sure that our family is doing what it needs to be doing. If we're the Christian home that God wants us to be, our influence on others while they're in our home or while they're influenced by our family, or which is the extension of our home, are we really being the shining lights and influence that we need to be? That will be our focus of thought today. But as we begin in part 2 of this lesson and in the second point, I think one thing has to be very clear before we really progress any further. And that is this. It's one thing to get your home in order. It's one thing to have things where God wants it to be. It's a completely different thing to keep it there. And there's a very interesting story that Jesus tells in Matthew chapter 12. He says, when an unclean spirit goes out of a man and goes through many places and seeks rest and finds none, and he says, I'll return back to the house from which I came. What he kind of paints a picture of there is that somebody's got their life in order. The evil has been gotten rid of, they've cleaned house, if you will, and now they're pure. That's good. But notice in this passage that the house was empty. When he comes back to the house that he left, he finds it empty, swept, and put in order, which sounds really good, but notice, it is empty. You ever heard the old saying and the old belief that a house that is not being inhabited will literally just kind of fall in on itself? You have to maintain that home. Just because it is clean, just because it is in order and swept, doesn't mean that it's going to sustain itself. You have to have the proper thing inside of it. Our next lesson will deal with, as Steve led us in the song this morning, we appreciate him doing that, Christ being an honored guest in our home. We're going to talk about that. It's not just that we clean house. It's not just that we get things in order, but we have to stay at it. Or else, just because we've removed something doesn't mean that it's gone forever. And as in this story, when that evil spirit comes back and sees that man's life swept in order, everything is good, he says, hey, nothing's here. Typically speaking, God is not here, so we'll inhabit this house. And he goes and brings back 7 other spirits more wicked than himself. And as Jesus says, the last state of man is worse than the first. And he says, so it will be with this wicked generation. Why do you think that's the case? It's because they were quick to get things right, maybe in some respects, but they didn't stay the course. If we seek to get our house in order and get things in the way that God wants it to be, to have a good Christian home, that's good. But the question is, are we going to keep it that way? It takes a lot of work to clean a house up, right? But it takes a constant focus to keep it where it needs to be. It's an everyday, I would say, battle at times, because we wage a war against something very powerful. So what's it going to take to keep our home pure? Well, number one, we got to keep our focus. We looked at this in the last lesson, but I go back to Joshua's statement once again. Joshua 24 and in verse 15, or verse 14 and 15, he says there, ultimately summing that passage up, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. In other words, just as we talked about with our children this morning, it really doesn't matter what anybody else is doing. Joshua is saying to Israel, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter if you serve the gods on the other side of the river or whomever. Me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. Now, it did matter who they served, but what Joshua was saying was, in regards to what I'm going to decide, I'm not going to be swayed to go your way. I'm not going to be swayed to go this way or that way. My house is going to stay in order, and we're going to serve God, regardless of what anybody else does. He says, choose for yourselves this day, which is a very important statement because it is a daily choice. Purity is a choice. You just don't wake up and your house is clean. You just don't wake up and your home is pure. You just don't continue to wake up day in and day out and it's just fixed itself. It is a daily choice that we have to make, and I would go as far to say it is an active work that includes everybody in the home. Fathers first, it's your job. You're the head of the house. We'll get to you in a different lesson, and I'll step all over my toes, possibly yours too. Mothers, it's up to you. Children have a part as well. But we have to stay determined to stay pure. We've got to have the proper mindset. Appreciate Boone reading this passage for us this morning, and we put that up there again. But what was Paul trying to tell the church at Philippi? What was his message to them? It was very simple. Keep your focus. If it's anything that is good, if it's anything that is praiseworthy, if it's anything that is pleasing to God, meditate on that and think on that. What does the book of Proverbs 23 and verse 7 say? As a man thinks in his heart, what? So is he. What are you talking about at home? What do you discuss? What do you focus on? What is our daily thought process in our home? You know, our home should be a place of meditation. It should be a place of prayer, of peace, of joy, love, and glory to God. But you know, that doesn't just happen. That has to be what we focus on. And that has to be what we talk about. Is that not to say we don't talk about work? No. Is that not to say we don't talk about school or sports or what's going on in our lives? No. But at the center of things and revolving around, everything else revolving around it, God has to be center stage. Do we ever talk about that at home? Do we discuss on Sunday evenings and on Wednesday nights? Do we discuss what our children have studied in class? Do they remember? Do we need to refresh them? What is the focus of our home? If we're going to stay pure, we're going to have to keep the proper mindset. Again, going back to Proverbs 23, for as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. I mentioned this just a moment ago, but I'll touch on this again as well, and we'll get much more focused on this moving forward. But again, this first lesson, part 1 and 2, is just kind of a general overview of what our thoughts need to be moving forward. But if our homes are going to be pure, and if we're going to keep it that way, then we must accept responsibility, and that goes from the top down. Fathers, husbands, you're in charge. You should be. The way God laid it out, you're in charge of this. And if that home is going in the wrong direction, if it's going down the wrong path, don't point the fingers at somebody else. It's you. There may be contributing factors, but ultimately, it's you. And it's me. It's my responsibility. It's our responsibility to make sure that that ship is going in the right direction, and if it's not, that we right that ship in the right direction. We have to accept responsibility. Finger pointing, you did this, all this is your fault. If it wasn't for this, that's not going to fix anything. It's not about finger pointing. It's not about he said, she said. It's not about you did and I did. It's about standing up, mature Christian, and saying, it's on me. I'll tell you how important it is. There's a story back in 1 Samuel chapter 2 of where Eli, of all people, a priestly lineage, a religious lineage and family of people like Eli and his sons, they are supposed to be the epitome or the example of what God's people are supposed to be. And his sons, when you go back in chapter 2, you'll find this. In verse 22, his sons are laying, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, they are laying with women, having sexual relationships with women at the doorstep of the tabernacle. They're not even trying to hide it, folks. And what does Daddy do about it? Daddy does nothing. Now why? I don't know. We're not told. But Eli does not restrain his sons. And the first prophecy, just think about if you're a young prophet and you're coming onto the scene and this is your first prophecy. This is Samuel. And he has to go to Eli and say, Eli, you didn't take charge of your home. You didn't accept responsibility for your son's actions, and you didn't correct them in the ways that they needed to be corrected, and you're going to have to answer for that. That's a tough message to give, especially if that's the first message you're going to give. But what is our focus there? Our focus is that there is a great problem in someone's home, Eli's home, and he didn't do anything about it. And what was the punishment? Well, his two sons lost their lives, as we read on into that. So what's the lesson that we might take from that? And I'm going to be very straightforward with you about this, but here it goes. Fathers, if we do not take charge, mothers are obviously worked into that as well, but we're talking about accepting responsibility from the top down. But overall, here's the issue. If there is an issue and it is not fixed and we're not striving to keep purity, if we just kind of let things go, if we become lax and just kind of let it flow and hope that it'll fix itself, we are killing our home. We're killing our family. That's exactly what Eli did, because he did nothing. If we're going to have Christian homes, we've got to do something. And it better do and have to do with God's will. Accept that responsibility. Change it. Seek God's guidance in doing so. Seek the prayers of the elders in doing so. The brethren, if need be. But it's got to be changed. It can't just be let go. Accept responsibility to keep that home pure. And stand firm. You know, anytime you're trying to do something good and sometimes making radical changes to something, typically you're going to experience quite a bit of opposition. That's that way in a lot of different things. If there's been a boss that has run a company a certain way for a long time, and he comes and you have a new person come in and they try to run things in a different way, maybe a more efficient way, typically the response they will get is, well, we've always done it this way. Why do you want to do it this way? Well, I'm trying to make things better. A lot of times it'll be like that in the sports world. You've had a coach that's coached a certain way forever. That may not be the only way there is to coach a ball team, but you have a new one come in, and people are very resistant to that. Why? Because it's a change. Maybe it's a better change, but it's not the way we're used to. Well, guess what? It'll be the same way in the home. It'll be the same way in the family. If we've grown accustomed to maybe falling a little bit short on some things, and we try to shore that up and change that, it might be met with some opposition. But we've got to stand firm against that. And it doesn't matter if it's mother or father. It doesn't matter if it's son or daughter. We've got to stand strong against that. That's what Jesus teaches in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 37. That if you really love me, then you love me more than anybody else, even your closest family members. What did Asa do when he became king? Well, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And he banished perverted persons from the land. But I want you to notice what he did. He stood up against his grandmother. His grandmother was going far beyond what she should have been doing, and she was making obscene images to a false god. And guess what? He removed her from queen, and he destroyed her image. You think he won Grandson of the Month award by doing that? Probably not. But that's what had to be done. And if we're going to make, if we're going to make our homes what they need to be, we're going to have to be tough. We may be met with some opposition, but we've got to stand firm no matter what. That's what it takes to keep that home pure. And we've got to design our homes in the right way. I mean this literally and I mean this figuratively as well, but our homes have to be designed and decorated in the right way. The style of our home, the focus of our home, and even how we decorate our home has to be conducive to that which is pleasing to God's will. I read an interesting story one time about a wealthy man who went to this art sale and bought some very, very expensive, very high-end, costly pictures and paintings. In the midst of what he bought and what he purchased was a picture of what somebody's idea, that is, of what Jesus must have looked like. So he had all these really costly paintings, and he had this really costly painting of Jesus in the mix. And he hired this high-end, really high-dollar, expensive interior design person to come in to look at his home and to place each picture and each piece of artwork in the proper place. And after a while of looking at that, he did that, and he comes back to the owner, and he has this painting of Jesus in his hand, and he says, "This doesn't fit in your home." And he was pretty offended by that. He says, "What do you mean it doesn't fit in my home?" He said, "So I said, this picture does not fit in your home." And he says, "I don't understand. I have plenty of room in this house. There's plenty of room. There's plenty of wall space. It'll go anywhere. What do you mean?" He goes, "No, I don't mean it's a room issue. It's not a space issue." He said, "It's a design issue." He said, "The design of your home doesn't match the style of what this picture brings into it. And if this picture is going to fit your home, then you've got to change the whole complete style of your home so that it will fit. In other words, you've got to design it and make it match in style to Christ, and then build everything else around it. You can't just throw it in the midst of everything else you have." Now, I don't know what kind of pictures he had on the wall. I don't know what kind of artwork it was, but obviously it wasn't anything close to Christ. And then just throw a picture in there of Christ and say, "Well, it fits." That doesn't work like that. And so it is in our spiritual homes as well. We can't have everything that we want to in the home and then at the tail end just throw Jesus in there and say, "Well, He's here." No, it has to be conducive to Him. Everything has to evolve and revolve around Him first. And that's what we'll talk about in the next lesson. We'll go into more detail with that. But how many of us really need to change the style of our home? It's amazing to me when you go back to the very beginnings of God's people, and as God is setting His people up to go into the land of Canaan, He says, "You're going to have your own homes. There's going to come a time where you're not nomadic people and you're not going to be wandering about anymore. And when you have your own homes, this is how I want you to set them up." Notice what He says. "Therefore, you shall lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes." That's your focus. Teach them to your kids. How? "When you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up, you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." You design your home to match God's will. You see that? Now what about ours? How closely does ours match that? Well, as we think about keeping our home pure, we really have to go into the next question, and that is, and we'll touch on this in the book of Isaiah. If you turn over to Isaiah chapter 39, the next question is your home a spiritual light? Let's go over there and read in Isaiah 39 about where Hezekiah brought some visitors into his home, and let's just see how he went about showing them things. Turn there if you will. I didn't put it up here on purpose because I want you to turn there and read with me, because I want you to see how Hezekiah handles himself here. Is your home a spiritual light? Again, are we focused on keeping it pure? Hopefully. Are we designing it in the right way? Hopefully. But the real telltale sign is, what do other people see? Is it a spiritual light? Are we a great influence on others? Or is he not found at all? Hezekiah, I want you to think about just a little bit of the background information here on where we're at. When you read there in the book of Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 38, we just read of where Hezekiah's life was extended 15 years. He got some pretty bad news one day that his life and his kingdom was going to come to an end pretty quickly, and he begged God for more time, and God heard that prayer. And he added 15 years to Hezekiah's days. Isaiah chapter 39, and in verse 2 through 4, we see a man whose life has just been extended 15 years and has nothing to say about God when somebody comes into his home. How is that? I mean, that's not the home that we need to have, is it? Follow along with me there. Isaiah chapter 39, let's start in verse 1. At that time, Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he heard that he had been sick and had recovered. 15 years, God has blessed you. Thanks be to God, you would hope. But in verse 2, Hezekiah was pleased with them and showed them the house of his treasures, the silver, the gold, the spices, the precious ointment, and all his armory, and all that was found among the treasures. There was nothing, notice this, there was nothing in his house or in all of his dominion that Hezekiah did not show them. And then Isaiah the prophet went to Hezekiah and said, what do these men say, and from where did they come to you? And Hezekiah said, they come to me from a far country, from Babylon. So happy to have these guests here. And he said, what have they seen in your house? So Hezekiah answered and said, they have seen all that is in my house, and there is nothing among my treasures. Notice what he's treasured. There is nothing among my treasures that I have not shown him. And then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the words of the Lord. Notice this in verse 6. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and what your fathers have accumulated will be carried away to Babylon, and nothing will be left. Let me ask you something. If all your treasures are cleared out in your home, what's going to be left? I would hope that if the treasure is cleared out, then all the things would be left. But I'm afraid sometimes that's not the case. We think so much of our things. We think so much of what we've worked for, what we've toiled for, what we've sacrificed for. And we're so happy to portray that to other people. But Hezekiah didn't show anything about God to those Babylonians. I hope we don't follow suit. Because you know what? Our home is supposed to be the central of the gospel. You might say that our home is supposed to be a gospel hub, if you will, from there branching out that the world would see God and see Christ. Hezekiah was so blessed by God to even be alive, as we are. And of all things to forget to show a visitor in his home, he mentioned nothing about God. And God reminded him, all these things that you think so much of, they're going to be gone one day. My question to you is, when our things are gone, what's left? What do people see when they visit your home? Do they see God? Do they see God's will? Do they see spirituality portrayed there and living there? You know, we get completely bent out of shape sometimes when we know that we have visitors coming. And I've heard people say it so many times, and I know we've said it. We all do. When somebody comes in our home, we feel like maybe we've left something undone, and we'll say, oh, please excuse the mess. We don't want people to see our mess. Are we that adamant? Are we that zealous about showing people God through our homes? Is your home a spiritual life? I would hope that our homes never look like Hezekiah's, and that we've been tremendously blessed and yet say nothing about God when our home is being observed. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 16, we should shine. Just as Matt talked about last Sunday night, and we'll have some more lessons moving forward. Our light should shine before men, and they should see our good works and glorify our Father in heaven. Again, our home should be a gospel hub. It should be a stepping stone between here and heaven. That's what our home should be. Is your home a spiritual life? One of the greatest homes that I can ever think of would be the household of Cornelius. Was it just that Cornelius just happened to be the one that Peter was sent to extend the gospel to the invitation of salvation and the gospel to the Gentile world? No, it just wasn't that. That was part of it. But I want you to think about beyond Cornelius' household. When Peter got there, Cornelius says, we're all here present before you to hear the things commanded you by God. And in chapter 11 and verse 18, when they heard these things and became silent, they glorified God. This is speaking of the Jews when Peter went back and told them. And what they realized is that God had granted salvation to the Gentiles as well. And who is that? Who are the Gentiles? That's everybody else. That's you, that's me. People that came before us and people that have come far after us. That all came through one house. To the household of Cornelius. He was the door by which that was introduced to us. Might I ask you, what has been introduced to others through the door of your home? Is your home a spiritual life? So, let's wrap this first lesson up, although it was really in 2 parts, but let's wrap it up and close this, and then we'll move on to some other thoughts in the lessons ahead. I think it's safe to say that our homes are very important. Very important. The question is, are the Christian homes? Are they the homes the way that God would have them? There's a great responsibility in caring for the home and for the family. And I think it goes without saying it's a responsibility that we cannot fail. In any way, we cannot fail in, or else it's just so many more problems that comes from that. We've talked about it from the ground up. As you've evaluated your home from the ground up, what have you seen? Are there things you need to work on? Likely so. Let's do that. If it's something of a public nature that we need prayers about, then let's all pray together for each other that we do better with that. If you're not a Christian in your home, you need to become a Christian. You need to make those dedications in your life. If you've been putting them off, for the Lord needs to be the center of the home. We need to strive to keep it pure. Everything must revolve around God and Christ. And our homes need to be alive. Here's the thing. This lesson is important, and this is why. This lesson is just a general consensus of, hey, where do you stand? We're really going to look at, moving forward, where you stand. But you've got to be on the same page to begin with. I can't be the father I need to be without the help of Julie. I can't be the husband I need to be without the help of her as a wife. She needs me. Our kids need us, and guess what? We need our kids. Everybody has a part to play. And we're really going to focus on that moving forward. But the first thing is, do you really understand how important your home is? And if God is not center stage, if Jesus does not live with you, as we're going to talk about in the next lesson, something's got to change. Let's change it now. And let's move forward with strong Christian homes. Appreciate your attention both last Sunday and this Sunday. I know that's kind of a long lesson, but I think that's a pretty good overview of where we're at and maybe where we need to be, and some good building blocks for where we're going to go moving forward. If there are changes you need to make in your life, we hope that you'll make that. You've heard me say it before, and I'll continue to say it. We're all in this together. So let's strive to work together. We may worship God together here, and we may go our ways and go into our own homes, but guess what? We're here for each other to make our homes better too. And we need to pray for each other and encourage one another. And if we can help you in any way in that today, we'd be happy to. Won't you come while we stand and while we sing?